All right, diving in today, getting deep as always, but this time we're going way back to ancient Greece to explore the mind of a real philosophical heavyweight.
Someone whose ideas, even though they're centuries old, still get us thinking about the really basic, fundamental nature of reality.
And I know you, dear listener, are all about philosophy.
And eager to grasp those big concepts, like efficiently, thoroughly, no time wasted.
Right, so that's exactly what we're going to do today.
Total immersion into the philosophy of Anaxagoras.
Drawing on, of course, the insights from, well, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
So right, this deep dive is all about Anaxagoras, 5th century BCE, and he was pretty pivotal, I'd say.
Pivotal how?
Well, first off, he was the very first of the pre-Socratic philosophers to settle in Athens.
Athens.
Yeah, and his big claim to fame. Two things, really. His everything in everything doctrine, definitely a head-scratcher.
Yeah, that one always gets me.
And then there's his idea of nous, which is like mind or intellect being the driving force of the cosmos.
That's the mover and shaker, right?
Yeah, you got it. But hold on, there's more.
Always more.
He also had these fascinating ideas about what celestial bodies are made of.
So like stars, planets, that kind of thing.
Exactly. He thought the sun was a giant hunk of red-hot metal, for example.
Wow, okay. Bold claim.
The moon he saw as earthy. And stars. Fiery stones. Now you got to remember, this was way before telescopes and all that.
So pretty revolutionary for his time. But where do we even begin with a thinker like this?
The foundation, always.
Yeah.
His metaphysics. That's where his whole system is built. And it gets pretty wild.
All right, so before we get into the really out there stuff, let's set the stage. I mean, Anaxagoras wasn't just thinking in a vacuum. He was part of a whole intellectual scene.
Absolutely. We have to put him in context.
So who were his philosophical peers, his influences, his rivals?
Okay, so first you've got the Milesians. These were earlier thinkers who were all about finding natural explanations for things. Ditching the myths, looking for the inherent principles in nature.
Okay, so they were the science-minded folks of their day.
Kind of, yeah. Then comes Parmenides, and he drops this massive philosophical bomb. Figuratively speaking, of course. But Parmenides, he's an Eleatic philosopher, and he argues super rigorously that what is not cannot be.
Okay, break that down for me. What does that even mean?
So basically he's saying that true change, like something coming into existence from nothing or ceasing to exist entirely, is logically impossible.
Because if something doesn't exist, it literally cannot be anything.
Exactly. And this was like a philosophical earthquake. It shook up everything people thought about the world, about change, about reality itself.
Because we see change everywhere. Things are born, things die, things transform. So how did Anaxagoras deal with this?
Well, he took Parmenides' challenge seriously. He agreed that genuine coming to be and passing away, like from nothing or into nothing, were impossible. But then he does something really clever.
I'm intrigued.
He reinterprets what we see as change. His first big principle is no becoming or passing away. What he's saying is that everything we perceive as creation or destruction is actually just mixture and separation, or what he calls dissociation, of eternal ingredients.
So the ingredients themselves never actually come into being or disappear, they just get rearranged.
Exactly. It's like, think of a building. The bricks and mortar are always there, even when the building is demolished.
They're just in a different configuration.
Right. And he actually puts this really nicely in a fragment, B17. No thing comes to be or passes away, but is mixed together and dissociated from the things that are.
It's like a giant Lego set. We just keep building and rebuilding with the same pieces.
Perfect analogy. And he applied this to everything. Animals, plants, you name it.
Even, you said earlier, the heavenly bodies.
Oh, yeah, all of it. He saw these things as natural constructs, basically temporary arrangements of more fundamental stuff like earth, water, fire, and the specific ingredients that make up living things.
Flesh and bone, right?
Yeah, exactly. And those ingredients, they're the truly real entities in a way that aligns with Parmenides' idea of being. They're eternal.
So they are the what is.
While the things they make up, those are just passing configurations.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get this. So that's principle number one, no becoming, no passing away, just rearranging the eternal Lego pieces. But you said there's another principle, and this one sounds even more mind-bending.
Oh yeah, get ready for this one. It's the everything in everything principle. And this is where it gets really wild.
Lay it on me.
Okay, so it's not just that these basic ingredients are eternal, but according to Anaxagoras, they're all present, all at the same time within everything else.
What? So like my cup of coffee has traces of gold in it.
Well, they probably wouldn't use that example, but yeah, the idea is that in the beginning, everything was mixed together, and even now, everything is still, in a way, in everything else.
But how can that be? We see separate, distinct objects all around us.
Right, but that's where it gets tricky. See, he was trying to tackle the problem of change, especially qualitative change, like how something hot can become cold.
Which seems like a pretty basic question, but philosophically, it's a huge one.
It is. So Anaxagoras says, look, those cold ingredients were already present in the hot liquid, just not dominant. As it cools, the proportions shift. Same with food. When we eat it, it becomes part of us, but for him, that's not some magical transformation.
It's just rearranging the ingredients that were already there.
Exactly. He even gives these crazy examples, like suggesting that hair and flesh are present in seminal fluid, just in such tiny amounts we can't perceive them.
So, like, everything is mixed together, but in different proportions, and those proportions are constantly changing.
That's it. And this idea, for a philosopher, it completely upends our understanding of what it means for something to be a distinct thing.
Because if everything has traces of everything else in it, how can we even talk about a thing's identity?
That's the philosophical challenge right there. It's like saying, well, is your coffee really coffee if it also has, tiny bits of everything else that exists or could exist?
Whoa. Okay, my brain is melting a little bit here. So if everything is in everything, that means these ingredients are constantly interpenetrating, right?
Right. It's not like they're just little solid bits bouncing off each other. Think of it more like fluids with different densities all swirling together.
Okay, fluid dynamics, I can sort of picture that.
And some people even suggest that these ingredients might not be material in the way we understand it today.
Like, they might be more like fundamental qualities or potentials.
Exactly. That's a whole other philosophical rabbit hole. But now let's add another layer to this already complex picture.
Another one. You said there were three core principles. We've done no becoming, we've done everything in everything.
Right. And this last one is super important for the whole system to work. It's the no smallest or largest principle.
No smallest or largest?
Anything. There's no limit to how small or how large any ingredient can be, or how finely it can be divided.
So you're telling me I could keep cutting a piece of gold in half forever and never reach a point where there's no gold left?
That's the idea. And this principle is key because it prevents the complete separation of ingredients.
Which would go against the everything and everything idea.
Exactly. If something could be totally isolated, then it wouldn't have everything else in it. And that would mean something could truly come into being or cease to exist.
Which Anaxagoras said was a no-go because of Parmenides.
Precisely. And when Anaxagoras talks about smallness, he's not talking about physical size. It's more about how submerged an ingredient is in the mixture, how low its density is.
So something can be small in the sense of being really spread out and diluted.
Right. And largeness means how prominent or dominant an ingredient is. Think of salt dissolving in water.
Even when the salt seems to disappear, it's still there, just in a really small form.
Exactly. And even in a huge block of salt, there are still trace amounts of other things mixed in.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see the connections here. So, no becoming, everything and everything, no smallest or largest, these are all intertwined.
They are, and they form this really radical framework for understanding reality.
As a constant flux of mixtures and separations of these eternal, omnipresent ingredients.
And it all came about because he was trying to address this fundamental challenge that Parmenides threw down about the very possibility of change. Amazing, right?
Mind-blowing, really. But we've only just scratched the surface. We've got this wild metaphysical picture. But how did Anaxagoras use it to explain the actual world, the cosmos, the stuff we see around us?
That's where his cosmology comes in. And it gets pretty interesting, too. So he starts with this unlimited mixture, the ocarin.
Cosmic soup, right.
Yeah, you could call it that. It's basically this primordial state where everything is mixed together, but it's completely undifferentiated, like a formless, chaotic blob.
No planets, no stars, no nothing.
Nope. And it's also motionless at first, according to fragment B1. Air and ether are the main things in this mixture, so imagine it like a thick, bright cloud stretching out infinitely in all directions.
Okay, I can picture that, sort of. But if it's motionless, how do we get from that to the dynamic, swirling universe we see today?
That, my friend, is where nous comes in, mind or intellect. This is the key to Anaxagoras' whole system.
You said before that nous is the driving force of the cosmos.
It is. Nous is what sets this primordial mixture into motion. It starts a rotation just in a small area at first, but then it expands outward, causing the ingredients to separate out and remix based on how dense they are.
So it's like stirring a pot, but on a cosmic scale.
Exactly. And this rotation, it just keeps going and going, expanding infinitely, and that's what creates all the different structures and objects we see in the universe. That never-ending process of separating off and mixing.
Pretty neat, actually. But wait, you mentioned that this rotation happens faster at the edges. How did he know that?
Well, we have a fragment, B9, where he says that. And it makes sense if you think about how things spin.
The farther out you go, the faster you're moving.
Right. Now, this separating off, it happens in two ways. First, there's the initial breaking up of that undifferentiated apron. Then, as things keep rotating, there's a lot of mixing and compacting going on. He even uses different Greek words for these two processes.
So it's not just one big separation, it's an ongoing process of things being pulled apart and then recombining in new ways.
Exactly. Now, because of this rotation, lighter things like air and ether get flung out to the edges, while heavier stuff, like Earth, gets pulled towards the center.
So we end up with the traditional Greek cosmos, with the Earth at the center, surrounded by the atmosphere, and then the celestial realm.
Right, and Anaxagoras even explains how the celestial bodies formed. He said the sun was like a giant fiery metal ball.
Still a pretty wild idea, considering what people thought back then.
And the moon. Earthy, he said, just reflecting the sun's light.
And the stars and planets, too, all formed from this cosmic rotation.
Exactly. He even had an explanation for meteors, those streaks of light in the sky. He said they were just stones thrown off from the Earth by the force of the rotation.
Okay, so basically space rocks. He was ahead of his time on that one.
Oh, and eclipses, too. He correctly explained them as the sun or moon being blocked by another celestial body.
So he was definitely observing the sky and trying to figure out how it all worked.
Absolutely. He also talked about the Milky Way, comets, the tilt of the Earth's axis, all sorts of things.
So this now isn't just setting things in motion, it's creating a whole ordered universe with all these different phenomena. Pretty impressive, I'd say.
And he doesn't stop there. He even applies this same thinking to the Earth itself, to geology, to weather, to everything.
Wait, what did he say about the Earth? You said it was flat and stationary, right?
Yes, that was the prevailing view at the time. But he wasn't just accepting it blindly. He explained how it got that way through the separation of ingredients.
So even though the Earth is formed by this dynamic rotation, it ends up being stable and unmoving.
Right. And he also explains how water is distributed, how mountains and plains formed, why we have rivers, all through the interplay of the ingredients in the cosmic rotation.
Okay, so the rotation shapes the Earth, but then the Earth itself is still. What about things like earthquakes? Did he have an explanation for those?
Of course. He said they were caused by air trapped beneath the Earth's surface, moving around and causing tremors.
Makes sense, kind of. And I bet he had something to say about the weather, too.
Oh, absolutely. Thunder, lightning, hail, the saltiness of the sea. He tried to explain it all in terms of natural processes and the interaction of the ingredients.
He was like the ancient Greek version of a scientist trying to figure out the workings of the whole world.
Exactly. And it's not just physics and cosmology. He was interested in perception, in how embryos develop, you name it.
A true polymath.
Now, here's where it gets really intriguing.
More intriguing than everything and everything.
Well, this one's right up there. You ready for this? He talks about other worlds.
Other worlds. Like aliens.
Not quite. But in a fragment, B4A, he says there are other worlds out there that have their own cities. Animals, a sun, a moon, everything, just as with us.
So like parallel universes.
It's not clear exactly what he meant. Some people think he was talking about other planets in our solar system, or maybe even entirely separate universes.
Whoa, that's a pretty big idea.
But if you think about his basic principles, the most likely interpretation is that he's talking about other places within this unlimited mixture where the same processes are happening.
So like other whirlpools forming within the larger cosmic current.
Exactly. These would be areas where the ingredients have separated out in a similar way to how they did in our part of the cosmos. And because Nous is governing everything, the same laws would apply, so you'd end up with similar structures.
So not necessarily alien life, but maybe other Earths, other suns, other galaxies, all forming in the same way.
That's the idea. And it's not just a random thought. It follows logically from his idea that Nous operates uniformly throughout the entire unlimited mixture.
That's pretty amazing when you think about it. This idea of universal laws, it's something we still grapple with today.
It is. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We still need to talk about knowledge. How do we know anything at all, according to Anaxagoras?
Right, we've talked a lot about nous, this cosmic mind, but what about our own minds? How do we humans come to understand the world?
Well, that's where things get a little murky. Even back then, people criticized Anaxagoras for not being clear enough about what nous actually is and how it works.
It's such a big concept, hard to wrap your head around.
It is, and he never really gives us a step-by-step explanation. He says nous knows everything, but he doesn't say exactly how it acquires that knowledge.
So it's sort of taken as a given.
Yeah, but it's clear that he sees nous as the source of both knowledge and perception, especially for living beings.
So it's not just about thinking, it's about experiencing the world too.
Right. Now, when it comes to perception, we do have some clues. From Aristotle and Theophrastus, we know that Anaxagoras thought all sensation involved a bit of discomfort or pain.
Pain. Why pain?
Well, his idea was that we perceive things through contrast. Like, if you touch something cold, it feels cold because your hand is warmer.
So it's the difference that causes the sensation.
Exactly. And this difference creates a kind of irritation, a disturbance, which we experience as sensation.
Okay, but not all sensations are painful.
True, but he might say that some of that irritation is just so mild, we don't consciously register it as pain. Think about how loud noises or bright lights can be uncomfortable.
Yeah, that makes sense. But if all our knowledge comes from our senses, and our senses can be unreliable, how do we ever know anything for sure?
That's the philosophical dilemma, isn't it? And Anaxagoras recognizes this. He talks about the feebleness of senses in fragment B21. And in B21a, he says that appearances are a sight of the unseen.
So what we see isn't necessarily the whole truth.
Right. He's saying that perception is just the starting point. We need to use our minds, our now, to go beyond those initial impressions, to interpret them and figure out what's really going on.
So like, seeing snow, it just looks white. But then you have to think about it and realize, okay, that's actually frozen water, and water is clear.
Exactly. We need thought to correct the errors of our senses. But just like Democritus, he doesn't go into a ton of detail about how this process of knowledge building actually works.
So we're left with this tantalizing idea of nous, this powerful intellect that can grasp the true nature of reality, but we don't have a complete user manual for how it operates.
That's philosophy for you. Always more questions than answers.
Well, on that note, maybe it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But before we do, let's talk a little bit about Anaxagoras' legacy. I mean, he was a pretty influential guy, right?
Oh, without a doubt. He wasn't just some isolated thinker. His ideas had a real impact.
In what way?
Well, remember, he was the first pre-Socratic philosopher to live and teach in Athens. It's huge.
Because Athens was becoming the intellectual center of the Greek world.
Exactly. So he's bringing this whole tradition of natural philosophy into the heart of Athenian culture.
And it's not just the location. Didn't he also have some famous students or followers?
Well, there's no evidence of a formal school or anything like that, but his influence is definitely there in later thinkers. And there's this story about his relationship with Pericles, the famous Athenian statesman.
Oh, yeah, I remember hearing about that.
Plutarch tells us that Pericles really admired Anaxagoras. Apparently, Anaxagoras was this calm, dignified guy, and his rational way of thinking really rubbed off on Pericles.
Helped him to make decisions based on logic, not just superstition.
Exactly. And some scholars even think that Anaxagoras' ideas about the natural world, about things not being controlled by capricious gods, had an impact on Athenian politics and culture more broadly.
So like a shift towards a more secular worldview.
Possibly.
Yeah.
We also see echoes of his ideas in the works of playwrights like Euripides and even in the comedies of Aristophanes, although often in a satirical way.
So he was definitely a known figure, someone whose ideas were being discussed and debated.
Absolutely. And the historian Herodotus, he knew about Anaxagoras' theories too. And then there's Democritus, the atomist philosopher. He was definitely influenced by Anaxagoras' ideas about perception and the nature of reality, even if he disagreed with him on some things.
So he's part of this ongoing philosophical conversation, sparking new ideas and challenging old ones.
Right. And his explanations for things like meteors, hail, and eclipses, those were actually quite influential for later scientific thinking.
So he's leaving a mark on both philosophy and science.
And it wasn't just his ideas. He was also known for being this really even-tempered, rational guy, which for some people became kind of an ideal for how a philosopher should be.
A model of intellectual detachment.
Now, here's a fun fact. In Plato's dialogue Phaedo, Socrates actually mentions Anaxagoras' ideas.
So even Plato was engaging with him.
He was, and there are some who think that Anaxagoras might have even been indirectly involved in the accusations of impiety that were leveled against Socrates.
Oh, wow. So maybe his ideas were seen as a bit dangerous by some people?
Possibly. Now, philosophically speaking, we see traces of his influence in all sorts of places. There's the Dervini Papyrus, which is this fascinating philosophical text that some scholars think might be connected to Anaxagoras' ideas.
It's like a philosophical puzzle trying to trace the connections between these ancient thinkers.
It is. And then there's Diogenes of Apollonia. He definitely picked up on some of Anaxagoras' themes, like the idea of a cosmic mind.
And what about Plato and Aristotle, the big names in Greek philosophy? Did they have anything to say about Anaxagoras?
Oh, yeah. Plato criticizes him in some ways, but there are also echoes of Anaxagoras' ideas in his theory of forms.
Like the way that forms are kind of eternal and unchanging, like Anaxagoras' ingredients?
Right, and Aristotle, even though he had his disagreements with Anaxagoras, he really respected him for recognizing the importance of mind and the cosmos.
And wasn't there something about eclipses?
Oh, yeah. Aristotle actually used Anaxagoras' explanation of eclipses as a model for how scientific explanations should work.
So he's having an impact even on how people think about science itself. Pretty impressive legacy for one guy.
It really is. And it shows you how these philosophical ideas, even from thousands of years ago, can still resonate with us today.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to end our deep dive into Anaxagoras. It's been quite a journey exploring his unique and challenging vision of reality.
It has. We've covered a lot of ground, from his radical metaphysics to his fascinating cosmology to his tantalizing hints about the nature of knowledge and the human mind.
And what stands out to me is how he took this seemingly simple question, how can things change, and turned it into this whole intricate system of thought.
It's truly remarkable. And what I find so compelling as a philosopher is how he tried to find a way to preserve the idea of fundamental being, of what truly is, while still accounting for the constant flux and change we see all around us.
So it's not just about denying change, it's about finding a deeper explanation for how it's possible.
Exactly. And while his system might seem strange or even a bit crazy at first glance, it's incredibly sophisticated and well thought out. And it laid the groundwork for so many later developments in Western thought, both philosophical and scientific.
Now, for you, dear listener, our philosopher in residence, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder.
Something to really chew on.
We've talked about Anaxagoras' idea that everything is a mixture, that even seemingly distinct objects are made up of these fundamental ingredients that are always present, just in different proportions. So here's the question. How does this perspective, this idea of everything being interconnected and interpenetrating, challenge or maybe even align with our modern understanding of what substance is, what identity is, what reality itself is?
It's a question that philosophers are still grappling with today.
And another thing to think about. What would a modern philosopher make of nous, this cosmic mind that Anaxagoras talks about? Can we make sense of a non-material ordering principle in a universe that we often describe in purely mechanistic terms?
It's a puzzle worth exploring.
And as always, we encourage you to go deeper. Check out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Anaxagoras. Explore the bibliography. Follow those intellectual threads wherever they lead you.
Happy philosophizing.
And until next time, keep diving deep.